Siebel Scholars, please welcome back Tom Siebel.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I just have a few comments that I want to make to frame this afternoon discussion. So if we look at kind of the information technology industry writ large, this is an industry in which we've seen some growth. When I left the graduate school of computer science at the University of Illinois, which doesn't seem that long ago, but I guess it was a little while. The worldwide market for information technology was about $50 billion. Today it's $3.5 trillion, and in 5 years it'll be $9 trillion. And so we've seen in this time frame, this goes back to 1983, we've seen a lot of advancements in information technology, from mainframe to mini computing to personal computing to the internet and what have you. And this has fueled this thing that Daniel Bell called the post-industrial economy, and what you think of as the information age. Now, we're at $3.5 trillion now, going to $8 or $9 trillion in 5 years. So this is hitting an inflection point where we're seeing dramatic growth in the information technology industry, and I believe this growth is being fueled by a new step function in information technology that we're seeing come online in the 21st century, this part of the 21st century, including elastic cloud computing, big data, the Internet of Things, and AI. And this kind of changes everything. Now, we have seen, for those of you who have read *Sapiens*, I think we've had, Homo sapiens on the planet for, order of 100,000 years. And, we've seen, a number of, the collisions of technology with society over time have been pretty disruptive, from the discovery of fire to the domestication of agriculture to, say, the Gutenberg press, the steam engine. And while many of the implications of these technological advances were quite positive, the negative implications that were unanticipated were horrific. Let's take the Gutenberg press. So the Gutenberg press enabled the Bible to be printed, the press enabled the Bible to be printed in multiple languages, right? And so then what followed was, Martin Luther, who, nailed his, statement to the door on this church in Wittenberg, and you have the Reformation, where all of a sudden everybody can read the Bible in their own language, and you have all these, Protestant religions, and what follows is, hundreds of years of religious wars, in Europe. Then we have, later on, the invention of the steam engine, the Jacquard loom, which brings on the Industrial Revolution. And we can argue that, I think a lot of people would argue that the Industrial Revolution was a good thing. That being said, you can draw a straight line between the invention of the steam engine and the Jacquard loom and, child labor, communism, World War I, World War II. I mean, it's a straight line, so there were unanticipated consequences of these technologies that were really quite deleterious, and we still live in the shadow of World War II today. I mean, we're still fighting that battle now. And Neil Ferguson, who's a scholar at Stanford, now at Stanford, previous at Harvard, would argue that World War I and World War II were the same thing, and it's still going on. Now, this next advance in information technology is really being fueled by AI, and this is truly a big deal, and I think it changes everything about information technology, and it changes everything about the way that we communicate, the way that we entertain ourselves, the way that we operate businesses, the way that we manufacture products. And I think you can think of AI, well, Julius Caesar used to talk about Gaul being divided into 3 parts, and I think you can think about AI as being divided into 3 parts. You have this field of AGI, artificial general intelligence, which some of you might be involved in. So I'm, undoubtedly going to insult, a few people in the next few, minutes, but this is the way it goes. Okay, and so you have this field of AGI, and this would get you to Google DeepMind. This would get you to, Elon Musk with the idea of, your smart refrigerator that's going to, take over your house, and HAL in 2001, and this gets to Ray Kurzweil and the singularity. And personally, I believe this dramatically underestimates the capacity of the human mind and the human spirit. There's no question that we will develop computers that can do any one thing better than a human being, say play chess or play Go or possibly drive a car, but that's, I think, questionable. But the idea that we can get a computer that will do everything better than a human being, I think, is something we need to worry about, okay, in the next few generations. The second application of AI is what we do at my latest venture called C3.ai, which is about the application of AI to commercial and industrial processes. And this is relatively benign, okay, where we're doing it for stochastic optimization of the inventory or production optimization or fraud detection or AI-based predictive maintenance. That being said, there are some pretty significant ethical implications related to privacy that people need to be worried about. Let's think about precision medicine. Precision medicine will be the largest commercial application of AI, hard stop. And we will, in a very few years, say, aggregate the healthcare records of the population of the United States, whatever that is, roughly 330 million people, I think. And we'll have the genome sequences, the healthcare records, pharmacology, radiology, healthcare history, the works. And we'll be able to aggregate those data into a unified federated image and build machine learning models that'll be of enormous social and economic benefit. For example, disease prediction, adverse drug reaction. We'll be able to predict with high levels of precision and recall, were we to prescribe opiates to this population who's predisposed towards addiction, that would be adverse drug reaction. Or disease onset, we'll be able to predict with very high levels of precision who is going to be diagnosed with what disease in the next 5 years, say diabetes or breast cancer or whatever it might be. And it's a solvable, supervised machine learning problem. And the opportunity there is that we can intervene clinically, okay, with these people and avoid the disease diagnosis. Well, this is all goodness in light, right? And people live longer, they live healthier, and healthcare is cheaper. We'll use AI for, I don't think we'll be, Watson ads aside, I don't think we'll be replacing physicians anytime soon, but we will most certainly be using AI for, AI-assisted medicine for physicians for reading radiographs or more precise diagnoses or genome-specific medical protocols. And again, this is all goodness and light. Well, where's the dark side? Well, somebody, either a single healthcare provider in the case of the government or a large aggregator in the case of United Healthcare, is going to have these data. And how are they going to use these data? And the idea that they're going to behave well with these data has been, we know that's not going to happen. See Facebook for details, okay? And and so, think about the ethical implications associated with this. Do you want to know that you're going to be diagnosed with a terminal illness in the next 3 years? I'm not sure I do. Oh, okay. Or how are these data going to be used? Are they going to be used to set premiums? Absolutely. Okay. Who cares about pre-existing conditions when we know what disease you're going to be diagnosed with in the next few years? How about in the case of you can imagine an administration in the United States, or you can certainly imagine an administration in Europe or Asia, okay, that will use these data to withhold health care from people where it just doesn't economically make sense. This will happen. So there are important ethical implications there that we need to be very aware of. But let's look at the third area. The third area relates to the application of AI into social media. And I believe, hard stop, this is the most nefarious and the most scary, okay? These guys, and the idea that we are so far beyond do no evil, okay? And this is no longer about money. Make no mistake, it's about power. And we have the ability to manipulate people, 2.2 billion people at a time. We have the ability to control exactly what news each and one of us see. Okay, we have the ability to use these devices to manipulate 2.2 people at the level, 2 billion people at the level of the limbic brain. So the limbic brain would be that part of the nervous system that we have in common with a lizard, right? It deals with the stuff of survival, food, water, sex, okay? And it emits a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Phone buzzes in your pocket, you get a release of dopamine. You pick up the device, you click on it, you have 5 new friends. You get a release of dopamine. You see who friended your photos, you get a release of dopamine. You post these photos so that other people friend your photos, you get a release of dopamine. It is unquestionably addictive behavior. And the implications of what's going on in what we're seeing and what's going to be talked about next, I think this is really, truly disturbing stuff. And so I encourage Rana and Carl and Alex. I hope you all take the gloves off and just kind of really rip into this one, because I think that if we don't understand this, there are secondary and tertiary implications of these technologies that we don't understand. Okay, and if we don't understand them and we don't figure out how to control them, we will be very sorry, because we're going to have to live there, and our kids are going to have to live there. So I just want to kind of set the table. I think this is a very important conversation. I hope you will become an active part of the dialogue in the second half, and this is really what I want to wrestle with all of you with tomorrow. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rana and the panel, and thank you very much.
Okay, so thanks for being back here, and Tom, thanks for that talk, and particularly your points about history, I think are really well taken. So we have a great panel. I will just quickly introduce everybody. To my direct right is Jean Twenge. I almost got it. Who is a professor of psychology at the San Diego State University, and she's also the author of really a fantastic book called iGen, which I read in part to understand my son. And I'm going to look forward to hearing you explain about what is happening to our children with everyone. To her right, we have, of course, Alex Kogan, who you all heard on Friday, and who is going to be fielding a lot of questions, I suspect.
Please ask hard questions.
And to his right is the only man that has been recognized consistently in our hotel, Karl Rove, former deputy staff to George W. Bush, Bush's brain, and a preeminent Politico.
Yeah, the guy who was the Yale history major and Harvard MBA needed to have a brain from a college dropout. Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I just had to say it.
Yeah.
All right, we have a lot of ground to cover on this panel, and you all have really different perspectives. So I think we're going to kind of divide and conquer in 2 parts. Jean, I'm going to ask you to start, because one of the things I was hearing in the various breaks was people wanting to hear a little bit more really about the health impacts and how these technologies, social media, big data are changing our brains, the way kids think, act, feel, what kinds of impacts they're having on this generation. And you've done a lot of work on that. So I know you've got some slides you're going to be showing us, and we've got those queued up. But before we start, Tell me a little bit about how you got interested in this field. Like, what was your path to this? What was the sort of penny dropping moment for you that led to this work?
Yeah, so I have researched generational differences since I was an undergrad here at the University of Chicago. It got me interested in doing my senior honors thesis, and have basically kept an eye on each generation as they have shown up. So I'm a Gen Xer, and I was trying to understand my own generation. Everybody called us slackers. We didn't like that. And then just using actual psychological data collected over time to try to figure out how the generations are different. Because when I started doing this work, there was a lot of speculation and very little actual data, much less data that has been collected over time so you can eliminate the effects of age. So I keep an eye on these very large, nationally representative data sets, primarily of young people, middle school students, high school students, college students, that have asked a bunch of different questions, including about happiness and mental health, in some cases back to the 70s, a lot of it since the 90s, and started to see some striking patterns. And that's what I'll show you in the slides, around 2011 or 2012. And realized, first of all, okay, millennials are now over, at least in these high school groups, that we have a new generation. Some people call them Gen Z, I call them iGen. And that might possibly be connected to technology. So I'll give that as a caveat. Until about 3 years ago, I didn't really do much research on technology at all. My expertise has always been in generational differences, but these days you can't understand generational differences without understanding something about technology.
Great point. So, all right, go ahead and give us the presentation, and then people, I think I'll open it up and we'll have a few questions, and then we'll move on to the other panelists.
Okay. First I'll start with there's two levels of analysis that I'm going to talk about. There's technology use among individuals and how that relates to their mental health. But there's also the question of what's happening at the societal level or the level of the generation. So I'm actually going to start there because, as I mentioned, that's where I started myself. And I have, in the course of my career, got used to seeing generational differences that were big, but would take a decade or two to get there. Then in these big surveys of young people, starting with the data around 2011 or 2012, I started to notice changes that were bigger and more sudden. I had really never seen anything like it. And I'll show you just a few of these. So this is from Monitoring the Future, 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders. They've asked these questions that measure symptoms of depression since the early 1990s. And right around that time, about 2011 or 2012, kind of all of a sudden, more and more teens started to say, I feel like I can't do anything right. My life isn't useful. I don't enjoy life. After it had been constant or even improving for several decades, it starts to change. Then I started to see these patterns in other data sets as well. This is a large federally funded screening study for major depressive episode, which is clinical level depression that really requires treatment. And it showed a very similar pattern. So that's 12 to 17-year-olds. It changes very little. They started this particular study in 2006. Doesn't do much until about 2012, starts to go up. That shift between 2011 and 2018 is just a 7-year period. It's a 75% jump in the percentage of teens who had clinical level depression in the last year. 18 to 25-year-old young adults took another year or so to start showing increases and have now reached the same level as the teens. But it is not just symptoms, and it's not just survey results. It's also behavior. And I can show you a number of examples of this. This is one that was published in a medical journal a few months ago from some of the folks who work for the National Poison Data System. So they get calls both from hospitals, doctors, as well as individuals about people who have purposely poisoned themselves in one way or another. Say it's often pills, for example. So this is a behavior that's more common among boys and young men than among less common among boys than among girls. So I'll show you the data for girls. And this is what it looks like. Very similar pattern, that it does very little, and that they started collecting the data in 2001 till, again, about 2012, and then it really goes up. So that's 16 to 18-year-old girls and young women. And there was an even bigger jump among the younger group, the 13 to 15-year-olds, where they started out lower than the older group, and now they're almost at the same level. So their jump is even more considerable. And in this case, we're talking about 2, almost 3 times as many cases, again, in a pretty short period of time. So when you see these graphs, and the 10 others that I could show you which show a similar pattern in terms of happiness and mental health, both in terms of symptoms and behavior, this is, of course, the question that everybody had anytime I show the graphs. And this is the question that I had. What happened? What happened around 2011 or 2012 that could be causing this? And at first, I had absolutely no idea. It didn't seem to line up with economic trends. There wasn't any big political event that happened then and kept going in the same direction. I puzzled over this for a very long time. Then I stumbled across a poll from the Pew Center for Research, and things started to fall into place a little bit. Because you know what happened around the end of 2012? This happened. You might have your own memory the first time you're in a public place and everybody was looking at their phones. Because just a few years before this, say in 2009, you didn't see scenes like this. Because what did people have back then? They had flip phones, which just weren't that interesting. You used to have to press the same button 3 times to get one letter on a text. Remember that? Or you'd take a selfie, you'd be like, is that me or is that my dog? Like, it just wasn't that interesting. It wasn't in color. It didn't have the internet. So the end of 2012, beginning of 2013, what that Pew Center poll found, that is when the percentage of Americans who owned a smartphone crossed 50%. So the iPhone was introduced in June 2007 and gained market saturation by the end of 2012. So that's 5.5 years from introduction to market saturation, which is the fastest adoption of any technology in human history, as far as we can tell. It's also around the same time that social media became used by a lot more people, especially young people. Among high school students, it's around this time when you get the shift from social media being optional to being virtually mandatory, which these days 85% of high school students are on social media every day, and it's 90% among girls. So, this is supposed to be animated, but that's okay. So why is that a compelling argument? It is, of course, impossible to prove for sure that smartphones and social media are behind this, because you could absolutely make the argument, well, how do you know that it's not something else? And you can't prove that for sure. You can't do a true experiment with generational research because you can't randomly assign people to be born at different times. It is literally impossible, right? So you have to go on the data that you have, which is going to be correlational, but it's not just the time sequence. It is the time sequence because it lines up and very little else does, but it's also, think about the effect on people's everyday lives and how many people it affected. So those are the next steps in the argument, that the adoption of smartphones, the increasing prevalence of social media is something that had an effect on a very large percentage of the population. 95% of teenagers now have a smartphone. So we were talking earlier about effects based on demographics. In terms of socioeconomic status and race and gender and so on, it's extremely pervasive. Region of the country, you name it. At least we're talking US data, very, very pervasive. It's something that happened to almost everybody, as opposed to other types of trends, like, say, the opioid epidemic, which instead was more focused on older people and has been more pockets of the country rather than more pervasive. The day-to-day life impact is also really important, that there's been a fundamental shift in the way young people use their time outside of work and school. It's not just the rise of social media and gaming and digital media overall. It's also what has digital media replaced. And we know from these surveys and others, less sleep and less face-to-face social interaction. These surveys have a bunch of questions on that, and across the board, that has declined, with the decline accelerating right around the same time, 2011 or 2012, in terms of the amount of time teens spend with their friends, just hanging out with their friends or going to the movies, or all of those things that used to be the favorite activity of teenagers. They're now a lot less likely to get together with each other face to face. The other thing is, of course, the amount of time you spend may have an impact on mental health among individuals, and we'll get to that in a minute. But even among people who are not using social media at all, or only using it a little bit, or only online a little bit, it has an effect on them too, because it's at the level of the social norm. So you take someone who isn't on social media at all, say a 16-year-old girl, who is she going to go out with when all of her friends are at home on Instagram or Snapchat? So it's not just at the level of individuals, it's at the whole social norm of teen social life has shifted. And then the other element, you saw that trend in self-poisonings. The great thing about the internet is you can have access to so much information. The bad thing about the internet is you can have access to so much information. And there are websites out there that tell young people, particularly young girls, how to harm themselves, how to starve themselves. This is everywhere. And with younger kids getting access to smartphones, instead of it being, the computer in the living room, the average age to get a smartphone is now 10.
Wow.
That's the average. So very young kids have often unfettered internet access, which sounds like it could be a good thing, and it could, but one of the big downsides is they can get access to this information about how to harm themselves if that's something that they're interested in. So that's another piece of the puzzle. And they can do that in a few minutes. They don't have to be on it for hours and hours a day. So then let's talk about the effect among individuals. So there's a number of studies on this. Here, it's going to be the teen population where we have the most data. And we have to ask the question, what is the association, bless you, with spending a lot of time on, I have electronic devices here. It's asked in different ways. It can be electronic devices. It can be the smartphone. It can be the internet. The last one is specifically looking at social media use, but digital media use overall. So let's look at some of these outcomes that are things we usually want to avoid. We'll focus first on the high users, so 5 hours a day or more. So those individuals are about 50% more likely to not sleep enough. Kids in this age group are supposed to get 9 hours of sleep a night, so less than 7 hours, pretty significant amount of sleep deprivation. So 50% more compared to, say, the light users. They're about 70% more likely to have at least one risk factor for suicide, like depression or thinking about suicide or actually having attempted suicide at some point in the past. They are twice as likely to say that they're unhappy, and they're about 3 times as likely to have low self-esteem. Now, there's another interesting feature of this graph. You notice that the non-users are actually not the best off. Yeah. So there's a couple of possible reasons for that. Some of it is correlational. Some of that could be who the kids are. Some of it could be that those are the kids whose parents took their phones away, so they're really mad, not very happy. It could also be there's probably some isolation involved in being the only one or one of the few who doesn't have social media or doesn't have a phone. But I think there's some good news in this. It suggests that it's not necessarily the technology or even using the technology. It's that using it too much. So using it a little bit, that's actually where you get the best outcomes. So it's limited use that, at least in this type of data, you get the best outcomes. Now, this is correlational. So what causes what? That's always the question. So is it that the use of social media and smartphones is causing depression and unhappiness? Or are the kids who are already depressed and unhappy spending more time on social media and smartphones? Right? So that's always the thing that you have to figure out, and confounding variables and all of those things too. We've been able to get rid of a lot of confounding variables because the surveys ask all kinds of questions on socioeconomic status and so on. So the causation, the direction of causation is an interesting question. So again, I think you have to think in terms of the levels of analysis. So first, at the generational level, we'll take that first in terms of the causation. Well, if you argued that it was depression causing social media and smartphone use, at the generational level, you would have to say, well, teen depression spiked for some completely unknown reason we haven't been able to figure out yet, and that caused kids to go on social media and buy smartphones. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So at the generational level, I think we can make a pretty logical argument that that probably is not what's going on. At the individual level, absolutely, that could be part of it. So there you have to look to other methods, longitudinal studies that follow people over time, experimental studies. Those are tough to do, but you can randomly assign people to limit their social media use for a week. There's been several studies that have done that, and they do generally find that, not on the first day, because then you have withdrawal symptoms, but after a week or 3 weeks, you do tend to get better mental health outcomes for people who either cut back, in some cases it's eliminate social media use. And we need more experiments in that area. Biggest longitudinal study that I've seen thus far came out recently, and it did show that you could predict depression a year later based on social media use, even if you controlled for previous mental health issues. Not all longitudinal studies have found that, but one of the largest that's ever been done did point in that direction. The interesting thing to me is the implications for that, kind of harking back to the morning panel, at the societal level and the level of economics and capitalism, it may not even entirely matter which way the causation goes, because if, say, if even part of the causation is going from using these devices and using social media a lot, and then that's leading to mental health issues. What we have is industries who are making money off of something that, when done to excess, which is what they want, because the more time you spend on it, the more money they make, is leading to serious mental health issues among children and adolescents. That's a pretty serious societal issue. Let's say it goes the other way, that at least some of it is going from kids who are depressed are then attracted to using these technologies at an excessive level. Then you're making money off of some of the most vulnerable people in the population. Also not a good look. One last thing that I will mention is, in the morning there was some discussion about law and policy. So that's what Shoshana was saying about we need to move to the level of passing laws. What's interesting to me, especially because I'm focusing on adolescents, and in some cases, some of that data is on fairly young children, with some of the strongest increases being among, in other data, say 10 to 14-year-olds show the largest increase in their suicide rate among all of the adolescent and child groups. Well, we have an existing law, and this is just one example. We have an existing law that says you are not allowed to have a social media account in your own name until you are 13 years old. I don't think that law is ever enforced, as far as I can tell. I mean, maybe occasionally. But it is extremely common for 7- and 8-year-olds to have their own social media accounts. And it's really common for 11- and 12-year-olds to have their social media accounts. They just put in a different birthday. So if we're going to start in some place, I can think of lots of policy changes and laws that might be good ideas to try to get around some of this. How about we think about that existing law and just enforce the existing law? That would be a great place to start.
Wow, okay, that is really insightful. Let me ask you a couple of follow-up questions, and then I'll bring in the other panelists. Have you looked at what parts of social media, and even what parts of the more kind of expanded range of behaviors, playing video games, whatever else it is, are the most addictive? Or because there's, talking about laws and legislation, there's a big push coming out of California and from some Congress people to say make loot boxes illegal, or to take different aspects of the technology. Is that useful, not useful? Kind of walk us through your thoughts on some of that.
Yeah, we don't know yet. I mean, a lot of the research just hasn't gotten to that level of specificity. And in fact, there's debate over even using the term addiction when it comes to some of these things.
Why?
Well, that's a whole huge discussion. There are people who argue that you can't compare something. Well, this is a behavioral addiction, arguably, that you can't compare that to, say, using drugs.
Why?
That for one thing, that limited use is okay. Limited use of cigarettes probably isn't a good idea.
Gotcha.
So there's that.
Okay.
And there's also, the brain studies there are some, but it's just not definitive yet to know for 100% sure that it looks the same. Does it look exactly the same as, cocaine? I don't think we yet know that, completely. I think we are starting to get, some guidance around, because it's absolutely true, spending 5 hours using the Maps function on your phone is not the same as spending 5 hours scrolling through Instagram. I mean, that's extremely clear. And I think, even without doing the study, it's extremely clear that's not going to have the same impact on mental health, right? So those are the types of things we have to look at. And kind of early data on that seems to suggest social media and internet use has a stronger association with mental health and happiness than gaming or videos and TV.
Interesting. And why? So, and break that down for me. Why is that?
Yeah. Again, we don't know for sure, but sorry, that's the academic statement, and I keep saying it.
No,
I
it's
love
true.
it.
I think. Listen,
Yes.
I'm always.
Yes.
I think it's great when people say I don't know.
So with social media, I think it's fairly clear some of the reasons why.
Okay.
So social comparison. Everybody else's life looks so glamorous on Facebook, right? Everybody else is always on vacation on Facebook and doing, all of the more wonderful things. And on Instagram, you don't, even if you know on an intellectual level that person took 200 selfies to get it perfect, you don't process that in your gut, especially if you're a 12-year-old girl. So I think there's and speaking of 12-year-old girls, there's the body image emphasis on it's so visual, it's such an emphasis on appearance and thinness and so on. It's clear that's a mechanism, especially for girls. That it is not in real time, that it's curated. There's just
But it's curated. What's the effect of that? Because many kinds of media are curated.
right, but that it's personally curated in that you only choose the things that are good
Okay.
and that look the best, and the selfie that turned out the
Okay.
best,
Yep.
and so on. And then everybody else
False reality.
looks right. And that it quantifies popularity. And again, I'm focusing on adolescents, but it's kind of true for adults. That it used to be if you were the popular kid in high school, you knew it. But now you really know it. Now you can say I have X number of followers, and you can see everything that everybody else is doing. It's not that you missed the party because you didn't get invited, where the cool kids had the party over the weekend. And it used to be, so when I was in high school in the 80s, people would be talking about it in the high school hallway on Monday morning. Now, you see it in real time, in pictures, on the Saturday night when you're at home by yourself.
Yeah. I want to just stop and poll the audience for a minute. How many people, raise your hand if you think that social media is addictive? Right. Okay. It's
Majority
interesting.
wins.
What's that?
Majority wins in this one.
Yes, yeah. It's fascinating that there's still an academic debate about this. Anyway, that's
There's an academic debate about everything.
that's
surprising there's not still an academic debate about gravity.
But I mean, you're.
Gravitons, are they real?
Oh boy, oh boy. Yeah, I mean, you're bringing up, there's so much to unpack here, because even just what you're talking about with brain science, I mean, you're making the point that, okay, this could be different than cocaine, but also social media could be different than, say, video games, then could be different than mapping, which doesn't mean that it doesn't have an effect. I actually read an interesting study about brain science looking at London cabbies. Do you know
Oh,
this
I know that
one?
study,
Yeah, is that, what
Hypothalamus.
you're shaking your head. You don't like that study?
I think this was a very specific sample size, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the fMRI data has, there's challenges to it. It's
I
probably
should say
this-
what the finding is. The deal was there was a study done looking at how parts of your brain that are exercised, let's say, by looking around, using maps in the real world, then kind of atrophy if you're doing GPS all the time. But you're saying that that's not.
And I buy it. I think the brain plasticity arguments are incredible. A lot of the work at MIT has been incredible. The fMRI literature in particular in our field has come under quite a lot of attack. This is not the venue to do it, but
Interesting.
in general, I would buy that belief.
Go
But the
ahead.
brain is plastic, and
Yes.
that's kind of the point that we're
100%.
making.
Okay.
That I mean, I think that, there's kind of I don't know. I think certainly before I learned about this research, you kind of have the idea of like, oh, the brain is your genetics, it's your biology, and it's just your brain. But your brain changes throughout life, and it changes based on experience, even when you're an adult.
Right.
So if you ask the question, well, if you are gaming 5 hours a day, is that going to have an effect on your brain? Well, of course it's going to have an effect on your brain, because everything you do has an effect on your brain. And the longer you do it, the more likely it is it's going to have an effect. The question is, what effect does it have? Is it a negative effect? And that's where, hopefully we'll have more data on that soon. But, at the moment, we don't know as much as I would like.
I want to open it up because I'm guessing that people have questions about all this. But let me just ask Alex and Carl, if you want to weigh in yourself on any points that Jean's brought up in the presentation, research. I don't know if you...
So I've got a question for Jean.
Okay, go for it.
That's okay.
Yeah.
So I was struck by the graphs in terms of the sort of the peak around 0 and then go down and go up, because that looks a lot like the findings for alcohol use and health.
Huh.
So like,
It does, yeah, I know what you
right?
mean.
And
You mean the last one?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Right, and
Do you want to pull that up?
Yeah.
it's exactly
Perfect,
this
yeah,
one.
yeah.
Yeah. So like, if
Yeah.
anybody's ever seen the
Oh,
graphs
that's
of like
interesting,
how many
yeah.
drinks you have
Yeah.
and health outcomes, the best is 1 drink, and having 0 drinks is worse. And then the more you get, it just goes off, right?
Right. And marijuana use?
Wait a minute. What do you mean zero's the worst?
Yeah.
Yeah, one.
You got something against teetotalers like me, man?
Yeah.
Well, as in like having 1 drink is the best for your health in terms of those correlational findings.
Yeah.
Right. Marijuana use in the 70s shows the same
Easy
thing.
to get 'em down the road to
The
perdition
kids who
by
weren't doing it
saying,
all
"Go
were
on."
really left out.
Yeah. So yeah, I was just kind of curious if like you think there are similar forces at play that are driving both graphs,
You mean both effects?
both effects, this
Yeah.
and alcohol usage in terms of health outcomes.
It's certainly possible, yeah, that a little bit being the ideal does seem to be a pattern that shows up a fair amount in health
Is
research.
there, just on that note, is there anything that makes it more difficult in the context of social media to have a little bit?
Well, if it is addictive, or even if you don't use that word, if it's designed to keep you coming back
Yes.
over and over, which
Yes.
it seems clear that it is,
Yes.
that's a difficult thing to pull off.
Right.
Even though it's maybe the best, it's the hardest.
Well, and this gets to a lot of the regulatory debate around marketing to children right now online. I mean, I got interested in this topic because my son became completely addicted to a variety of things online, but in particular one soccer game. And pulling him off of this, I mean, literally, we have to lock up phones now. And this is not a kid that has problems putting away other things that he likes, which is what's interesting to me.
Yeah, and then imagine a kid who does have a hard time putting
Right.
away other things.
Right.
I have one of those. And
Okay.
So yeah, almost every parent I talk to, because I give a lot of talks to parents.
Yeah.
Every one of us describes it as a constant struggle.
Yeah, I know it is. Tell me a little bit, how old are your kids? You have one child?
I have 3 kids.
Okay.
Almost 13, 10, and 7.
And do you notice any difference in the gender, ages, in terms
Well,
of
I have
how
all
this-
girls, so I
Okay.
can't do gender.
Okay.
Mostly it's just the variation in their personalities.
Yeah.
That has the impact, but also age certainly, because with the average age being 10, by 4th or 5th grade, my oldest, for example, most of her friends had a phone, and in my 6th grade, middle school, virtually everybody had their own smartphone, usually fairly unregulated, even though there are good parental controls now on both iPhones and Android devices. As far as I can tell, the majority of parents just hand a 10-year-old a smartphone and don't lock it down at all.
Yeah, that's so interesting. All right, go ahead.
So one thing I wanted to just add is I think the business model argument is really powerful with a lot of these things.
Yeah.
So like on Google, Google is more successful the less time you use it, right? So if I go on Google and quickly find what I want, they've succeeded, right? So they're optimizing. On Facebook, it's the opposite, right? The more time I spend on there, the better it is. Video games, same thing. Not all video games are the same. If I just pay $60 for the story-driven game, I could spend 10 hours and be done.
But not the kind of game like your son plays.
Exactly, not
Very
Fortnite,
smart.
Right,
Yeah, right.
exactly.
where you need
The-
those
the free
hours.
games.
The free games, and they have boomed, the free
Yeah.
games.
Yes.
And there you want the
100%.
hours.
Yeah, no, it's
Right.
so interesting.
Right.
Let me just, we're going to go on to the political discussion and bring you guys in, but let me just stop for a minute and ask if there are questions that anybody wants to pose to Jean or others, but about this topic. Go ahead.
Probably.
Troy Sandberg, UC San Diego Bioengineering, 2018. I really like the Theodosius Dobansky quote, which is, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." So I want to know, to what extent do you consider the evolutionary pressures that shaped humans? Because, you know, Tom mentioned the limbic brain, and
Yes.
human infants have an innate fear of snakes and spiders, even if they've never seen one before,
Right.
because our proto-mammal ancestors 100 million years ago, back when the dinosaurs still ruled the planet, they had to have that ingrained into their neural architecture. And we evolved as social mammals, like in small groups that were
Right.
tribalistic.
Right.
And during puberty, you're forging your social networks. So it
Right.
seems like the kind of thing that you could easily, when you have these systems that especially set up information asymmetry, like you only put the good stuff on Instagram, so you're comparing yourself to them, and socializing is very important. And that could maybe explain some of the trends, like a little bit is good, because we do need that, but it's also, you get endorphins. It's like a
Yeah.
drug addiction.
Right.
And even you mentioned alcohol. Apes' ability to tolerate ethanol is fairly unique to apes, because when we were just foraging for fruit, fruit that went bad and fermented and had ethanol, most animals can't tolerate ethanol at all. And so we actually evolved better enzymes to break it down, because that let our ancestors survive. And now we live in a world where we have social media and calories are not an issue, and this is why we have obesity,
Right.
and social media
Right.
is pernicious. So how much does evolutionary biology color your opinions of these things?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah. So I'm not an evolutionary biologist. However, I agree completely that, especially with adolescents, you know, the evolutionary pressures of that age around status and mating and so on explain a lot. And when you were talking, what it reminded me of was something that Sean Parker, one of the founders of Facebook, said recently. He said, Facebook exploits a vulnerability in human psychology, but we did it anyway.
Yeah.
And I think
yeah.
that's especially true for this age group, that is what they're craving, is getting the likes, the feedback, all of those things, you know, are very much hitting those evolutionary buttons. The irony, or maybe not irony, of it is that it doesn't really work in the long term. So depression is a good example. There's a guy named Steve Alardi. He wrote a book called The Depression Cure. Great book. So his argument is depression is a disease of civilization. That hunter-gatherers, for the most part, didn't get depressed because they already had all of these things that we have evolved to need. Sunshine, exercise. One of those is face-to-face social interaction. And if you're, on Facebook and you're getting lots of face-to-face social interaction, we find that you put those two things together, you're not going to get that unhappiness and depression. Where you're going to get it is where you're replacing one with the other, where it's the screen time is becoming predominant. And this is what's happened at a generational level, but you can think about it as individuals as well, where the screen time is replacing face-to-face social interaction with other human beings, which we're hardwired to need from an evolutionary point of view, because if you weren't getting that, you got kicked out of the tribe and you were literally dead. So we really need this, and screens can't, they feel like they can replace it, but they can't. It's like you need to eat an apple, but what you're getting is Apple Jacks.
That's so. Carl, I want to ask you a question about this. Are you thinking about how much did you already know about everything Jean just presented, and are you thinking about that in terms of voting and political patterns in this generation and how you're?
Well, I read Jean's book, so that's about as well prepared as one can be to read Jean's book. But no.
You're not thinking about
No.
this yet?
Look,
yeah.
we're talking about adults. If you're thinking about candidates, adolescents, you're generally thinking about candidates. So we spend most of our time thinking about
Okay.
adults.
All right. We'll come back to that. Another.
The oldest are 24, so they are voting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Look, there is a big difference between how you communicate between, your point about 2011 and 12. Back in 2010, a campaign would spend 2-3% of its budget, total budget, on digital. Today, 25 or 30%.
That's
And
so
it's because
interesting.
as younger voters age up,
Yeah.
they're less likely to get it from the 65 or 70-year-old still watches the evening local news.
Yes.
They don't. And they're getting their information from the internet, so you have to be where they are.
That's really fascinating. Let's have maybe one or two more questions on this topic, and then we're going to move on. In the front there, whoever.
Sure. I'm Lauren. I'm from MIT, bioengineering. And I had a question. So Australia has tried this new thing with Instagram where they have taken the number of likes off of the app. And I don't know if it's a positive thing to try to decrease the quantification of comparisons or to try to lower the activation barrier of posting, which might make people more addicted. But if they are doing it for what they think is a positive good, is it the app's responsibilities to help address some of these concerns about mental health? And if not, whose is it? And when do we reach the tipping point?
Yeah. So now I have to preface by saying, I don't do business or economics, but the difficulty is Instagram's business model is that they want people to spend more time on it. That's how they make money. So it's a much harder sell for them as opposed to someone like, say, Apple, where if somebody buys the device and if they only use it for the Maps function, Apple's pretty much good with their profit. I mean, not entirely, but pretty much. So it's a tough sell. And then it just gets to the question of, capitalism versus moral and ethical debates where I think probably that's above my pay grade. But you could, I think, make that argument of, look, we're talking about mental health and in some cases serious mental health problems and among kids, not even just adults, but among pretty young kids. And should there be a responsibility? I think there should be at least some responsibility. I think the most obvious solution is just to enforce the law that you can't have the account before you're 13.
Okay. We can come back to all of this, but I want to give the other panelists a little airtime in the 15 minutes or so before we have our break, and then we're going to have another 45, so lots more to come. Alex, I was going to come to you, but I actually think I'm going to save you until the end and give you plenty of time for the tough questions. But Carl, just because we've been talking about these generational shifts, I wonder if you can, as somebody that has been working with data across various medium and media for generations now, or at least decades, tell us the progression of data in politics and kind of maybe use your own career and experience as a lens for that. And are we at a fundamentally, in the same way that Shoshana seems to portray this as a new kind of capitalism, is this an utterly new kind of politics?
Well, the short answer to the last part of that is yes, but we've been in similar positions before. Yes, social media may be of a bigger dimension of the kind of communications change in politics, but it's been before. I mean, think about the early days of the United States. We got most of our political information from several hundred local newspapers who were tied together in a network by party. So if you were a Federalist paper, you got articles from the Boston Courier. If you were a Democratic paper, a Republican paper, Democratic Republican paper, you got it from the Richmond Whig. And you basically, they had circulation in the hundreds, most of them. Several of them had circulations in the thousands. And the way that you communicated that political information was generally, you've seen the famous George Bingham pictures of people standing in front of the post office and somebody's reading a newspaper aloud and people are discussing it. Imagine how much change came along in 1844 when suddenly we had the telegraph and no longer did it take news 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 weeks to reach from Boston to Savannah, but you got the news instantaneously. Suddenly we had a national network of news. Think about the difference in the 1860s and 70s when steam-powered printing machines made it possible to have cheap newspapers. No longer did you have to buy a newspaper for a nickel, you could buy a newspaper for a penny. So suddenly we have an explosion in the number of newspapers and their circulations. The circulations now are in the tens of thousands. There's 14 newspapers in 1873 in the city of New York, 14. Think about radio. fundamentally changed the relationship between the average American and their chief executive. You read the speech of Woodrow Wilson in the newspaper. You read the speech of Theodore Roosevelt in the newspaper. Now suddenly we now gathered around, the new fireplace, the radio, and listen to the fireside chat of Franklin Roosevelt. Think about the dramatic change brought on by the explosion of television. 1952 is the first presidential TV ads, which are literally hand-drawn cartoons, with a "We Like Ike" and a parade of elephants and people, chanting "We Like Ike." By 1960, if you watched the debate between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, you thought Kennedy won, but if you listened to it on the radio, you thought Nixon won.
Yeah.
And we saw a dramatic change in the nature of American politics by that. Now we've had the cable TV starting in the 90s, talk radio starting in the 80s. Neither one of them as big as maybe the last two before that, and now we have the internet and social media. And it's come on rather rapidly. Now, when I started, I was a young aide. We'd had a brief period of time during which there had not been a Republican governor in Texas, 114 years. And I was a young aide to the new Republican governor of Texas. And I started my business, political business, mostly doing direct mail, and he was my first client. And we started in 1981 in Austin. And there were lots of people in direct mail. And I thought the only way I'm going to be able to compete with all these people in Washington is to get a technological edge. So I bought a Hewlett-Packard Mini, which was the size of a piano, with 2 disk drives, each of which were the size of a washing machine. They had less computing power and less storage than this. And I used to take my Hewlett-Packard units, the units that access the system, I'd have to have them occasionally repaired. I took them to a walk-up on Guadalupe Avenue where a young 21-year-old kid named Michael Dell would repair them for me. Son of a bitch never asked me to invest in his company. But we were literally the largest throughput. We had a Hewlett-Packard printer, Hewlett-Packard 3000. We were literally, this tiny little company in Austin, Texas with 22 people, was the largest HP throughput in the world on this HP 3000 printer. We had 3 of them. They literally had a full-time repair guy assigned to us because what we were doing is we were doing things that were not being done elsewhere and taking these computer files of donors and voters and creating lookup tables and doing some personalization, and we were able to do it with the HP printer and the HP device before. This was like completely unknown. And it gave me the technological edge to build a business. I've always been interested in technology. First major political campaign in America to do a significant, before 1986, if you wanted to do sort of targeting, micro-targeting, you had to take census block data and make judgments about a census block. That's how you arrived at this was a blue-collar household or this is a college-educated. You were looking at data on the census block basis. And you then tried to derive ideas about who those people were and how to approach them. In 1986, we did a project in Missouri which has no party registration. We took the people who voted in the Republican primary and the Democratic primary, sort of put them aside for a minute, and literally to collect information about who those people were, we had to call every one of them. So we called 1.2 million people and asked them some questions that helped us model who they were. And this was enormously expensive, but it was enormously valuable because it allowed us to get inside, figure out who they were. By 2000, we sort of were into data big time, but the tools were rudimentary. It's the Antediluvian age, it's the Jurassic period, so these are like Stone Age data sets. By 2004, we do the first micro-targeting in the Bush re-election campaign because we know that we've got to find a lot more voters. And so we took 150 pieces of household level information. We had about everybody in the battleground states, did a large survey in each one of those states. So like in Ohio, you would typically do a poll of 600 or 800 people. We did 4,000 or 5,000 so that we could take those answers, attach all that information about the 150 pieces of information to that each individual household, and then attach it to everybody in the state and turn it over to the data scientists and let them find what were the patterns of particular answers that allowed us to say, here are other people just like that. And we were looking for, on a horizontal scale, 0 to 100, how likely were they to vote for Bush? 0, never going to do it, 100, likely to do it. On a vertical scale, it was 1, they're never going to vote, 100, they're absolutely certain to vote. And then in a third dimension, sort of the box behind that, what motivated them to vote, one way or the other. And so this allowed us to target our efforts on neighbors, people in neighborhoods based on their propensity. They were lower propensity, less inclined, but still available, persuadable for Bush. And that's where we focused our effort for persuasion and for get out the vote as well, because we were trying to get marginal voters to the polls. Bush gets 50 million votes in 2000. He gets 62 million votes in 2004. And we've spent 3 years testing all this in 2001, 2, and 3. It's the first election which they get micro-targeted. The Republicans still have this advantage in 08, but McCain is completely, his entire campaign is like, data is bullshit, we're not gonna pay attention to it. We're gonna be the merry pirates, we're gonna go in on a bus, and we're gonna drive around critical battleground states, and all this data is bullshit, we're not gonna pay attention to it. 2012, Obama has micro-targeting. And because of an unbelievable decision by Facebook, they're able to deploy that in a way that nobody before and nobody since has been able to deploy it. Facebook, for some reason or other, doesn't understand that the connections between everybody on Facebook can be monetized. So in essence, the Obama campaign is able to take Facebook, to say Joe Smith's or Susie Smith's contacts on Facebook, and map them. So they literally have billions of connections to this gigantic pool of Obama volunteers and Democratic activists. So they know among the target voters who knows who. So they can say Susie Smith needs to talk to these 10 people, and John Smith needs to talk to these 20 people. And after the election, the Obama campaign Facebook figures out we made a mistake. But for one election, somebody is able to map the connections between their volunteers and donors and their prospective voters.
Before you go any further, let me ask you 2 questions. Did you all understand, on the conservative side, did you understand what was happening and it was simply a McCain decision that he didn't want to go that direction?
Well, it was McCain's decision not to go that direction, yeah, but everybody else had figured it out. See, we had a weird thing in Texas. Starting in we don't have party registration in Texas. You're a party member by who you vote for. By accident, when Clements gets elected in 1978, he and John Tower, who's running for re-election, Senator Tower, run a gigantic get out the vote operation in which they have 110 phone banks that make like 4 million calls. So they're literally calling virtually everybody who's got a phone number in Texas and saying, are you Republican or Democrat? Are you for Clements or are you for his opponent? Are you for Tower or his opponent? And prefacing that with a couple of issue questions to sort of find out who they are. And we do this in 78, 80, 82, 84, 86, 88, 92, 94, 96, and 98 every year. Every 2 years we do this. Can you imagine having 20 years of data where you can literally say, Alex said in 1978 that he was for Bill Clements, but in 1982, he said he was for Mark White, the Democrat, and in 1984, he said he was for Phil Gramm and Ronald Reagan. So, I mean, we had that data so that we could continue to massage it. So Texans were used to thinking about the population in terms of not, just sort of big, discrete pockets, but individual level data that had been collected by these phone banks over the years.
I gotcha. Let me also ask you to tease out the difference, both in elections and just in the broader context of social media and how you target people. What's the difference between micro-targeting and persuasion in your mind?
Yeah, look, we conflate the two. Micro-targeting is using data. We just finished a project in Texas. We took every unregistered household in Texas, and now for less cost than we had in 2004 to do Texas, we took every unregistered household and took 680 pieces of household level information in order to model them, in order to identify on a scale of 0 to 9 how likely are they to be Republican, or 0 to 9, how likely are they to be Democrat? Now, that's targeting, and that's a more efficient way to deploy your campaign resources. Social media is a means to communicate a message. Now, it's a new means, and so we haven't figured it all out, but it's a means to communicate. So there's a fundamental difference between the two. You cannot get that level of specificity in your targeting on social media. You can say, okay, I'm looking for women aged 35 to 55, or I'm looking for single white men aged 25 to 45, but you can't target to the household level that you can with a voter file. And so you can literally pick out people off of the voter file when you micro-target and mail them something, or do addressable TV, or have, better yet, we have an app called, we're doing door-to-door for this voter registration. Well, we have a good idea based on the micro-targeting of what is going to motivate that voter. So the script per household changes. The volunteer knocks on the door of the Smiths, and he's got what we think is the best script for the Smiths. They knock on the Garcias, and they got a different script. They knock on the Rodriguezes, they got a different script, based on what we know from micro-targeting of what we think the most appropriate messages for that household are.
So in the couple of minutes we have left before break, I want you to walk me through Obama wins, cover stories everywhere. This is the big data election. What are you thinking, and then what do you do between then and 2016?
Well,
which we're going to spend a lot of time on when we come back.
Let me take what the Republicans did is we lose. Everybody says we have a lousy chairman, Michael Steele, who's done a terrible job, and what we need to do is we need to get and we've got a new chairman who's just come aboard, Reince Priebus, and he is attuned to the data shortage, and so what he does is the Democrats have caught up and surpassed us. He turns around and says, let's begin to surpass them. So by 2016, the Republicans are back into dominance on data, but only because of an incredibly stupid mistake by the Obama people that I, to this day, do not understand.
Which is?
There's this weird guy in Chicago. Anybody ever met Harper Reid? Yeah. Okay, so one weird-looking dude. He's got sort of this mustache that looks like, an old cartoon villain, sort of swirls around. He makes his money in a crowdsourcing T-shirt operation internationally. So they create a community of people, they design T-shirts, they let the community vote on the T-shirts, and they make the T-shirts that everybody wants to buy, and they sell them to them. And he makes a lot of money on this. The side benefit is that he figures out all the problems of how do you make something in the United States and send it to Croatia and pay the duties on it. So he's got the software built to literally sell things around the world, and you just enter where your customer is, and it tells you what to do with regard to tariffs and taxes and forms. So he makes a bunch of money off the crowdsourcing T-shirt operation, and then makes a bunch more money off of selling the software service to help anybody sell. You want to sell American bourbon from Kentucky and sell it around the world? He can help you with how you ship it all out. He gets hired in 2011 by the Obama campaign to be their chief technology officer and recruit all the engineers. And he's really entertaining and can size up people well, and he spends most of 2011 collecting several hundred engineers who are here in Chicago. By November, December, it's all screwed up. They come to him and say, the guy we got in charge of this is meeting no deadlines. We have none of the apps. Their key app was called Gordon. Gordon is nowhere. We got a problem. You got to stop going around the country recruiting engineers. And by February, the guy is in charge of the Obama data operation. And by May, Gordon is done, and it is a killer. He's the guy who he and his team figure out how they can mine the data. Now, just imagine how powerful that is to be able to say, here's our universe of Obama target voters for 2012. The people who are less likely to vote and are somewhat disposed towards Obama but need reinforcement. And you suddenly know not only who they are, but you know who their connection is among your volunteers. There's this letter written in 1840 by a lanky lawyer in Sangamon County, Illinois. He was chairman of the Whig campaign committee that year. He said, make a perfect list of the voters, ascertain with certainty for whom they will vote, have the undecideds talked to by someone they hold in confidence, and on election day, make certain that every Whig is brought to the polls. Now, Abraham Lincoln was a great president, but he's also a pretty good practical politician, and the most powerful thing he said was, have the undecideds talked to by someone they hold in confidence. And suddenly the Obama campaign has literally billions of data points about who are the people whom those people are likely to hold in confidence. Now, they win. And there is idealist Harper Reid saying This stuff is going to be spread around the world. All of these tools that we have developed are now going to be open source for small d Democrats around the world. We'll change politics around the world. We'll make it easier to run campaigns. We'll make it easier to put people in touch with target voters. We'll make it easier to raise money. And all these tools are going to be available. And as a big D Democrat, all of this data that we have collected from the campaign is now going to be available in 2014 and 2016 to every Democrat. And instead, the Obama High Command says, these tools are now going to be locked away and nobody's ever going to use them. And all this data is, poof, going to disappear into a vault someplace in Michelle's closet. Poof, gone.
Oh,
and the
boy.
the reason is because all of the people in command of the campaign said, you know what? All this data shit is really interesting. And if I start a business in the data sphere, I can make a lot of money, so by God, we don't want these tools floating around because I want people to spend a lot of money with me to recreate those tools and get new data.
I have to ask you one more question before we break. I know we're over time, but did you believe Alex's fireside chat?
This?
I'm a person, Carl.
Yeah, look, you're listening, so I'll be candid. Cambridge Analytica was a group of crooks, liars, cheats, and frauds. And Alex, with all due respect, you should not have taken data that you received for research and been talking to them about monetizing it.
I didn't receive data for research. That part's not true of the story.
Well, did Facebook say to you that it was for research?
No, they did not.
Well, then Facebook has got a problem because that data was, I understood, for research.
It was not.
But shouldn't be getting stuff from Facebook and making it available to somebody else. That was their data. And unless they said, you got a right to go sell this to people, you shouldn't be selling it to people.
We did get that, actually.
Yeah, well then, Facebook is dumber than I thought. Because look, think about the imbalance. Do you think Eric Schmidt called up the Romney campaign and said, oh, there's a really great use being made use of all of our Facebook data by the Obama campaign, and if you're just smart enough, you can have the same use. Do you think he did that? No. And yet data in politics is enormously powerful. It has always been thus. Do you know how they did surveys in the Gilded Age? Political surveys? They went door to door and hit every single door. In August and September of 1896, the county chairmen in Iowa and Kansas and Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois, who have been told to do a door-to-door canvass of everybody in every precinct, report back that the Republican candidate for president, William McKinley, is losing as much as a quarter of the Republicans in Iowa and lesser amounts throughout the Midwest, enough so that he's going to get wiped out if something doesn't change in the campaign. And that's because they had data of an elementary but large nature. And to me, it is just one of the amazing stories of 2012 is that Facebook has given out all this data and letting it be used free by the campaign. We have a law in this country that says that you cannot give something to a campaign of value. Mm-hmm. And data is powerful. I mean, you have to charge a fair market price for it. And Facebook's attitude was, this has no value to it, so you're welcome to use it, but they made no attempt to make that both sides had access to it.
Okay, folks, this is what we call a cliffhanger. So you're going to go off and take a 15-minute break and think about your questions, and then we're going to come back, and Alex, you're going to show your slides, and we're going to continue.